He stood there, blind but not broken, a decorated war hero with medals he could no longer see. The marble floors of First National echoed as security escorted him outside, all because he couldn't verify his identity their way. What Thomas Miller didn't know was that the quiet man in the corner had witnessed everything. The stranger in the leather jacket wasn't just any bystander, it was Keanu Reeves. And what happened next would transform not just one veteran's life, but an entire city's understanding of dignity, accessibility, and the power of unexpected compassion. Thomas Miller hadn't always navigated the world in darkness. 4 years ago, he had been Captain Thomas Miller, an Army Ranger with 27 successful missions under his belt and the respect of everyone in his unit. His commanding officers described him as the soldier you want beside you when everything goes wrong. Steady, resourceful, and unflinchingly brave. The photos from that time showed a man with bright eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, standing tall in his uniform, medals gleaming on his chest. The mission that changed everything started like many others. Thomas and his unit were tasked with clearing a small village in Afghanistan, ensuring safe passage for a humanitarian convoy. Intelligence had indicated minimal resistance. The intelligence was wrong. What awaited them wasn't just resistance but a carefully planned ambush. When the first explosions hit, Thomas did what came naturally. He prioritized his team over himself. 3 of his men were pinned down in a collapsed structure. Without hesitation, Thomas navigated through enemy fire to reach them. He managed to get all 3 to safety, returning multiple times through the firefight. It was during his final rescue attempt that the IED detonated. The blast threw Thomas 20 feet, but not before he'd pushed the last soldier out of the blast radius. When Thomas woke up in a military hospital a week later, the world had gone dark. The doctors explained that shrapnel had severed his optic nerves. The damage was irreversible. The transition to civilian life hit Thomas harder than the explosion ever could. The military had been his purpose, his identity. Now, at 34, he found himself learning the most basic tasks all over again. How to eat without spilling, how to navigate his apartment without crashing into furniture, how to tell denominations of money apart by their subtle differences in size and texture. The military pension helped, but it wasn't enough in the expensive city he called home. The apartment he'd bought years ago now had a mortgage he struggled to pay. His savings had dwindled with medical expenses not covered by veterans' benefits. He'd tried finding work, but employers grew uncomfortable when they realized the extent of accommodations he would need. His guide dog, Shadow, a black Labrador with an intuitive understanding of Thomas's needs, became both his eyes and his closest companion. Pride was both Thomas's strength and his weakness. He refused most offers of help, determined to prove, perhaps mostly to himself, that he could manage independence. His small circle of friends had learned to offer assistance subtly or not at all. They understood that for Thomas, dependency felt like failure. The war had taken his sight but not his dignity, and he guarded what remained with fierce determination. Every morning, Thomas followed the same routine. He would wake at 5:30 a.m., a habit from his military days that proved impossible to break. Shadow would guide him on a 3-mile walk through the neighborhood, Thomas's hand resting lightly on the harness. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every dip and rise in the pavement. The local coffee shop owner, Maria, would have his black coffee ready, placing it directly into his hand with a gentle, "Good morning, Captain." These small moments of normalcy anchored his days. His financial situation had grown increasingly precarious over the past 6 months. The Veteran Support Center had helped him set up automatic bill payments, but a recent computer error had caused several payments to fail. His mortgage was now 2 months behind, and the bank had sent notices he couldn't read. The text-to-speech software on his computer had read the threatening legal language to him in its flat, emotionless voice. Failure to remedy this situation may result in foreclosure proceedings. Thomas had made an appointment at the bank to straighten things out. He'd prepared meticulously, having his friend James help him organize all the necessary documents the night before. James had offered to accompany him, but Thomas had declined. "I fought in 3 combat zones," he'd said with a forced smile. "Pretty sure I can handle a banker." What Thomas didn't anticipate was how the world had changed while he'd been deployed. Security protocols had tightened. New verification requirements had been implemented. The small-town bank he remembered had been acquired by a national chain with standardized procedures that left little room for exceptions. In a world increasingly designed around screens, facial recognition, and digital verification, Thomas's blindness had become more than a physical limitation. It had become a barrier to participating in fundamental aspects of society. As he made his way to the bank that morning, Shadow guiding him confidently through the busy streets, Thomas had no idea that this routine visit would become the catalyst for a movement, or that a chance encounter with one of Hollywood's most beloved actors would transform not just his life, but an entire city's understanding of accessibility, dignity, and what it truly means to see another person's worth. The First National Bank stood imposing in the heart of downtown, its glass and steel structure reflecting the morning sunlight. Thomas felt the warmth on his face as Shadow guided him up the stone steps. He counted them silently. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. A habit that helped him map spaces in his mind. The heavy doors swung open automatically, releasing a blast of cold air conditioning. Inside, Thomas detected the faint scent of polish and perfume, the hushed tones of professional conversations, and the soft beeping of electronic devices. "Excuse me," he said to no one in particular. "I need to speak with someone about my mortgage account." A receptionist approached, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "Do you have an appointment, sir?" Her voice carried the practiced politeness of customer service. "Yes, at 10:30. Thomas Miller." He shifted his weight, one hand gripping Shadow's harness, the other holding the folder of documents James had organized for him. "Please have a seat, Mr. Miller. Someone will be with you shortly." The receptionist guided him to what felt like a leather chair. Thomas sat, Shadow settling at his feet. He heard other customers moving around him, the rustling of papers, the occasional ping of a cell phone notification. 15 minutes passed before he heard his name called. Shadow led him toward the voice, following the staff member to a small office where the sounds became muffled as the door closed behind them. "Mr. Miller, I'm Brian Westfield, account manager. How can I help you today?" The voice belonged to a young man, probably in his early 30s based on the pitch. Thomas explained his situation, the payment errors, the foreclosure warnings, his need to establish a new payment plan. He pulled out his documents, placing them on what he assumed was a desk. "I'll need to verify your identity before we proceed," Brian said, the sound of typing accompanying his words. "Can I see a photo ID, please?" Thomas reached for his wallet, producing his veteran's ID card and sliding it across the desk. "I'm legally blind, as you can probably tell. Lost my sight in Afghanistan." "I see." The typing paused. "Unfortunately, Mr. Miller, our security protocols require that I verify your identity through our digital system. I'll need you to look at the camera on this tablet so we can match your face to our records." Thomas felt his stomach tighten. "I can't do that. I'm blind." "I understand, sir, but it's bank policy. We need to confirm you are who you say you are." Brian's voice carried an edge of discomfort. "My ID card has my photo. I have my discharge papers here. My dog's registration. Everything proving I'm Thomas Miller." He pushed the documents forward. "I'm sorry, but without completing the digital verification, I cannot access your account information or make any changes." Brian's chair squeaked as he leaned back. "Perhaps you could bring someone with you next time? A family member who could help with the verification process." The suggestion hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I don't need someone to verify I'm me," he said, struggling to keep his voice level. "I served my country for 12 years. I lost my sight protecting others. And now you're telling me I can't access my own bank account because I can't look at a screen." Brian cleared his throat. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but I don't make the policies. Security protocols exist to protect all our customers." Thomas stood abruptly, Shadow rising beside him. "Your security protocols are discriminating against disabled veterans. That's who you're protecting your customers from." His voice had risen enough that he knew others could hear. "Sir, please lower your voice." Brian's chair rolled back. "If you continue to be disruptive, I'll have to ask security to escort you out." "Disruptive?" Thomas felt heat rising in his face. "I'm trying to keep my home. I made an appointment. I brought my documents. I did everything right." What happened next unfolded rapidly. The office door opened. New voices entered. Deeper. Authoritative. "Sir, we need you to come with us." A hand grasped Thomas's arm firmly. "Don't touch me," Thomas pulled away instinctively. Years of combat training making the movement sharp and defensive. Sir, we need you to leave the premises now. The security guard's tone left no room for negotiation. Thomas stood his ground. I have a right to access my account. This is discrimination. More hands now on both arms. Shadow began to growl, sensing his master's distress. Your dog needs to be controlled, sir, or we'll have to call animal control. That threat broke something in Thomas. He couldn't risk Shadow. Fine. We're leaving. He allowed himself to be guided toward the exit, dignity in tatters, rage and humiliation battling within him. As they approached the main doors, a voice called out from the lobby. Excuse me, what's happening here? The voice was calm, measured, impossible to ignore. The security guards paused. Bank matter, sir. Nothing to concern yourself with. It looks like you're removing a blind veteran with a service dog from your premises, the voice continued. I'd say that concerns everyone in this room. Thomas couldn't see the silent ripple that moved through the bank as customers began to recognize the speaker, couldn't see phones being raised to capture the moment, couldn't see the security guard's expressions shifting from authority to uncertainty. But he could hear the change in the atmosphere, feel the shift in energy as the stranger stepped forward, placing himself between Thomas and the exit doors. Thomas stood tense, his hand gripping Shadow's harness as the stranger confronted the security guards. The bank lobby had fallen silent, a collective breath held by everyone present. Thomas couldn't see the impact of the stranger's presence, but he could feel it, the sudden shift in power, the hesitation in the guard's movements. This man is a customer of your bank, the stranger continued, his voice calm yet carrying an unmistakable authority. He's also a decorated veteran who sacrificed his sight in service to his country. I'd like to understand why he's being removed. One of the security guards cleared his throat. Sir, this isn't your concern. The bank has protocols. I'm making it my concern, the stranger interrupted. Thomas heard footsteps as the man moved closer. My name is Keanu Reeves, and I'd like to speak with the branch manager immediately. A ripple of whispers swept through the lobby. Thomas furrowed his brow, the name registering vaguely in his mind. He'd lost his sight in 2019, when Keanu Reeves was already famous, but Thomas had never been much for celebrity culture even before his injury. The name meant little to him beyond a general awareness that the man was an actor. Mr. Reeves, one of the guards began, his tone suddenly deferential. We're simply following bank policy regarding identity verification. Mr. Miller couldn't complete the required procedures. Because he's blind, Keanu stated flatly. That's not following policy. That's discrimination. Thomas felt a light touch on his arm, different from the forceful grip of the security guards. Mr. Miller, I apologize for intruding, Keanu said quietly. Would you mind if I helped address this situation? Pride warred with practicality in Thomas's mind. He'd spent years fiercely guarding his independence, refusing help even when it made his life harder. But something in the stranger's voice, a genuine respect that treated Thomas as an equal rather than a charity case, made him nod. The branch manager, Thomas said firmly. I want to speak with whoever makes the policies. Absolutely, Keanu agreed. We'll get this sorted out together. Within minutes, the energy in the bank had transformed. The branch manager appeared, apologizing profusely, though Thomas noted the apologies seemed directed more at Keanu than at him. They were ushered not to a small office but to the executive conference room, where chairs scraped against carpet as people settled in. As they walked, Thomas realized Keanu had positioned himself not as a guide but as a companion, walking beside rather than leading him. The subtle distinction meant everything to Thomas. You don't need to do this, Thomas said quietly as they followed the manager. I'm sure you have better things to do than fight my battles. This isn't just your battle, Keanu replied. This is about basic dignity and accessibility. It matters to everyone. In the conference room, Thomas heard the rustle of expensive suits, smelled coffee being poured, felt the artificial coolness of executive privilege. The bank officials began with another round of apologies, explanations of security protocols, legal requirements, corporate policies. Thomas listened, Shadow lying quietly at his feet, as Keanu asked pointed questions about alternative verification methods, reasonable accommodations, ADA compliance. The actor spoke with unexpected knowledge about banking regulations and disability rights. You know, Thomas said during a pause in the conversation, I still don't really know who you are. I lost my sight before I could see any of your movies. A moment of silence followed, then Keanu laughed, a genuine warm sound without a trace of offense. Then I guess you're the only person in this room judging me entirely on my actions rather than my reputation. That's refreshing. For the first time since entering the bank that morning, Thomas smiled. He hadn't expected to find an ally today, certainly not one who understood that what he needed wasn't pity but respect. The meeting at the bank concluded with half-hearted promises to review their policies and consider alternatives for customers with disabilities. Thomas recognized the language of institutional delay, words designed to pacify without committing to actual change. As they left the building, Thomas felt the afternoon sun warm against his face, a stark contrast to the cold corporate environment they'd just left. They aren't going to change anything, Thomas said flatly as Shadow guided him down the steps. They'll wait until the PR risk passes, then continue business as usual. Keanu walked beside him, his footsteps measured to match Thomas's pace. You're probably right about their intentions, he agreed. But intentions can be changed when the cost of inaction becomes too high. Thomas stopped at the bottom of the steps, turning his face toward Keanu's voice. Look, I appreciate what you did in there. Really. But I don't need someone fighting my battles or turning me into some kind of cause. I understand, Keanu replied, his voice carrying no hint of offense. How about lunch instead? No causes, no battles, just food. I'm starving, and there's a diner around the corner that makes a mean club sandwich. Thomas hesitated. His instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of his routine. But hunger and curiosity won out. All right, lead the way. The diner was noisy but comfortably so, filled with the clatter of plates and the murmur of conversations. Thomas appreciated how Keanu quietly described the layout, table for two at your 2 o'clock, about 15 feet ahead, without making a show of assistance. After they ordered, Thomas felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease. So, you're an actor, Thomas said, breaking the silence between them. Anything I might have heard of? Keanu chuckled. Maybe. The Matrix, John Wick, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Thomas smiled slightly. The Matrix, yeah. Never saw the others. Lost my sight in 2019, and before that, I was deployed more often than not. Didn't have much time for movies. That's all right, Keanu replied. Movies are mostly visual anyway. You're not missing much with mine. Mostly me looking serious and occasionally shooting things or doing kung fu. The self-deprecating comment surprised a laugh out of Thomas. Their food arrived, and Thomas appreciated that Keanu didn't offer to help as he navigated his plate, finding the sandwich with practiced movements. Can I ask about your experience? Keanu questioned after they'd eaten in comfortable silence for a few minutes. Not just today, but generally, navigating places that weren't designed with accessibility in mind? Thomas considered the question. Usually, he deflected inquiries about his disability, but something about Keanu's straightforward tone made him want to answer honestly. It's exhausting, he admitted. Every day is a series of obstacles. ATMs with touchscreens instead of buttons. Websites that don't work with screen readers. Restaurants with menus I can't read. And always, people who either treat me like I'm helpless or ignore me completely. Keanu listened without interrupting, without the sympathetic noises Thomas had come to hate. When Thomas finished, Keanu asked, what could make the biggest difference? If you could change one thing about how businesses operate, what would it be? Training, Thomas answered without hesitation. Not just accessibility features, though those matter, but training staff to see the person, not just the disability. To understand that accommodations aren't special treatment, they're equalizers. Their conversation continued through lunch, shifting from accessibility issues to Thomas's military service, to Shadow's training, to Keanu's motorcycle collection. Thomas found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years, about his unit, about the friends he'd lost, about the moment he realized his sight would never return. As they finished their meal, Keanu said, I have a proposal for you, but I want to be clear. You can say no, and that's the end of it. Thomas tensed slightly. What kind of proposal? I know some people, journalists, disability rights advocates, lawyers who specialize in ADA compliance. What happened to you today isn't just wrong. It's illegal. With your permission, I'd like to connect you with them. Thomas frowned. I told you I don't want to be a cause. Not a cause, Keanu corrected gently. A catalyst. This isn't just about today or about you. It's about the next veteran who walks into that bank. It's about changing systems that were designed without people like you in mind. Thomas ran his fingers along the edge of his empty plate, considering. His instinct was still to refuse, to handle his problems alone as he always had. But he thought about the next blind veteran, the next person with a disability who would face those same walls of bureaucratic indifference. What exactly would I need to do? He asked finally. Just tell your story, Keanu said. The rest will follow. Thomas took a deep breath. All right, but no charity cases. No fundraisers with my face on them. This is about changing policy, not generating pity. Agreed, Keanu said, and Thomas heard the smile in his voice. No pity. Just change. By the following morning, Thomas's story had begun to spread. It started small. A local news blog published an article titled, Blind Veteran Denied Banking Services. Actor Keanu Reeves intervenes. By noon, regional news stations had picked up the story. By evening, it had gone national. Thomas first realized the scale of what was happening when his phone began ringing constantly. Old military buddies, distant relatives, neighbors he barely knew, all calling to say they'd seen his story. He'd given a single interview to a journalist Keanu had connected him with, answering questions honestly but without embellishment. He hadn't expected the response that followed. This is getting out of hand, Thomas told Keanu when the actor called to check on him. Thomas sat on his couch, shadow resting against his leg, the television murmuring in the background. Another news segment about the incident. I just wanted to resolve my mortgage issue, not become some internet sensation. The story resonates because it's not just about you, Keanu explained, his voice calm through the speaker. It's about all the invisible barriers people face. Your experience put a human face on an abstract problem. Thomas sighed, running a hand over his face. The bank called. Suddenly they're very interested in working with me on my mortgage. They've assigned me a dedicated representative to handle my account. That's good, isn't it? Keanu asked. It's convenient, Thomas replied, an edge of bitterness in his voice. They're helping me because I became a PR problem, not because it was the right thing to do. What about everyone else? What about the people without a famous actor stepping in? The line was silent for a moment before Keanu responded. That's exactly why this matters. This isn't just about getting your personal situation resolved. It's about systemic change. Later that week, Thomas found himself sitting in a downtown office building, facing a group of disability rights attorneys. The law firm, one of the most prestigious in the city, had offered to represent him pro bono in a potential ADA compliance case against First National Bank. The lead attorney, Patricia, had laid out a compelling argument about how the bank's policies violated federal accessibility standards. With your permission, she explained, we'd like to pursue this as a class action lawsuit. You wouldn't be the only plaintiff. We've already identified several other customers with visual impairments who have experienced similar treatment. Thomas's fingers tapped anxiously against Shadow's harness. I'm not looking to get rich off this. That's not the point. Patricia's voice carried a smile. That's clear to everyone, Mr. Miller. The goal here isn't primarily financial compensation, though that may be part of the settlement. The goal is to force policy change, not just at First National, but across the banking industry. As Thomas considered the proposal, Keanu's plan continued to unfold in ways that surprised even the actor himself. What had begun as a simple act of standing up for a stranger had evolved into something larger. Keanu had mentioned Thomas's situation to several influential friends in the entertainment industry, who in turn had shared it with their followers. The hashtag #BankingForAll had begun trending on social media, with thousands sharing their own stories of accessibility barriers in financial services. Keanu had also reached out to veterans organizations, connecting Thomas with support networks specifically designed for disabled veterans. These groups provided Thomas with resources he hadn't known existed: adaptive technology specialists, housing advocates, and peer mentors who understood exactly what he was experiencing. 3 weeks after the incident, Keanu invited Thomas to meet with him at a downtown hotel conference room. There are some people I'd like you to meet, he explained over the phone. Business leaders who want to be part of the solution. Thomas arrived at the designated time, Shadow guiding him through the hotel lobby. The conference room buzzed with voices that quieted as he entered. Keanu greeted him warmly, guiding him to a seat at what felt like a large table. "Thomas, thank you for coming," Keanu began. "I've invited representatives from several major banks, retail chains, and technology companies. They've all expressed interest in revisiting their accessibility policies and implementing more inclusive practices." "And they needed a blind guy as a prop to motivate them?" Thomas asked, his tone sharper than he'd intended. A woman's voice responded from across the table. "No, Mr. Miller. We needed a wake-up call. Sometimes it takes a public relations crisis to force corporations to examine their blind spots, if you'll pardon the expression." Thomas recognized the voice from television interviews. Catherine Donovan, CEO of a major tech company. "So this is damage control," he said. "Initially? Yes," Catherine admitted candidly. "But good policy can come from selfish motivations. My company has already begun revising our authentication systems to be more accessible for visually impaired users. We should have done it years ago." Over the next 2 hours, Thomas listened as business leaders presented concrete plans for improving accessibility. Not vague promises but specific timelines and budgetary commitments. A banking association representative announced the formation of an accessibility task force that would include disability advocates in policy development. A technology consortium pledged to develop open-source verification systems designed specifically for users with visual impairments. Throughout the meeting, Keanu remained largely silent, interjecting occasionally to ensure Thomas had opportunities to speak, to challenge assumptions, to share his expertise as someone who navigated these barriers daily. Thomas gradually realized that while Keanu had initiated this gathering, he had no interest in leading it or being its face. The actor had created the connections and then stepped back, allowing the momentum to build organically. As the meeting concluded, Thomas felt a complex mix of emotions: hope tempered by skepticism, pride complicated by discomfort with his newfound visibility. Keanu walked him out of the hotel, their footsteps synchronizing naturally. "You've started something significant," Keanu said quietly as they waited for Thomas's ride. "This isn't just about one bank or one incident anymore. It's becoming a movement." Thomas shook his head. "I didn't start anything. I just tried to pay my mortgage." "Sometimes the most powerful catalysts for change are people who were just trying to live their lives," Keanu replied. "The question now is, what happens next?" Thomas turned his face toward the sun, feeling its warmth as he considered the question. What had begun as a humiliating experience had transformed into something he couldn't have imagined. A platform, a purpose, a way to make the world more navigable not just for himself but for others facing similar barriers. "What happens next," Thomas said finally, "is we make sure they follow through. Words are easy. Change is hard. I want to see actual results." Keanu's hand rested briefly on his shoulder. "Then that's what we'll focus on. Making sure this moment becomes more than just a news cycle. Making sure it leads to real change." The impact of Thomas's story spread through the city like ripples in a pond, touching communities and institutions far beyond the banking sector. Local news stations began running investigative segments on accessibility challenges faced by disabled residents. Reporters tested businesses with hidden cameras, documenting the obstacles encountered by people with various disabilities. What they found revealed a city built primarily for the able-bodied, with accessibility often treated as an afterthought. City council meetings, typically sparsely attended, suddenly overflowed with concerned citizens. At one particularly charged session, a group of veterans arrived in uniform to show solidarity with Thomas. Though he hadn't planned to speak, the crowd's encouragement persuaded him to approach the microphone. "I never wanted attention," Thomas began, Shadow steady beside him. "But since I have it, I want to use it wisely. This isn't just about banks. It's about grocery stores where I can't use the self-checkout. Restaurants with menus I can't read. Voting booths I can't operate independently. It's about the right to move through the world with dignity." The council responded by establishing an Accessibility Advisory Committee, with Thomas named as a key member. The committee was granted actual authority, the power to review city contracts and development plans for compliance with accessibility standards that went beyond minimum legal requirements. Meanwhile, First National Bank found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. While their executives had initially hoped the story would fade quickly, Keanu's involvement had ensured sustained attention. Competing banks seized the opportunity, launching ad campaigns highlighting their accessibility features and hiring disability consultants to revamp their services. The lawsuit moved forward, with more plaintiffs joining each week. As legal pressure mounted, First National's board of directors realized that fighting the case would cost more in legal fees and reputation damage than simply implementing the requested changes. 6 weeks after the incident, they reached out to negotiate a settlement. The terms were comprehensive: mandatory disability awareness training for all staff, alternative verification methods for visually impaired customers, physical modifications to all branches, and financial compensation for affected customers. Most significantly, the bank agreed to hire a chief accessibility officer with actual power to implement and enforce inclusive policies. Beyond official responses, the city's residents began making changes in their daily interactions. Business owners installed braille signage and trained staff on assisting customers with disabilities. Restaurant managers approached Thomas, asking him to evaluate their establishments and suggest improvements. A local tech startup developed an app that helped visually impaired users navigate public transportation, inspired directly by challenges Thomas had mentioned in an interview. Keanu's role throughout this transformation remained deliberately low-key. He declined interview requests about the situation, redirecting attention to Thomas and other disability advocates. Instead, he worked behind the scenes, connecting Thomas with influential people who could turn awareness into action. One evening, as Thomas finished a meeting with the Accessibility Committee, he found Keanu waiting outside City Hall. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," Keanu said. "I wanted to see how you're holding up with all of this." They walked together through a downtown park, the summer evening warm around them. Shadow guided Thomas along the path while Keanu described the sunset painting the sky in colors Thomas could no longer see. "It's exhausting," Thomas admitted. "Every day, more interviews, more meetings. People want me to be the face of this movement, but I'm not sure I'm the right person. There are advocates who've been fighting these battles for decades." "You've brought those advocates a spotlight they couldn't access before," Keanu pointed out. "You're not replacing their work, you're amplifying it." Thomas nodded slowly. "Maybe. Still feels strange, going from invisible to hypervisible overnight." "The attention will fade," Keanu said. "What matters is the changes that remain after the cameras leave." As they continued walking, Thomas realized something had shifted in his perspective. 4 years after losing his sight, he had focused on what he'd lost: his vision, his career, parts of his independence. His energy had been consumed by adapting, by proving he could survive without assistance. But survival wasn't the same as purpose. Now, unexpectedly, he had found a new mission. His experiences, painful as they were, had value. His voice carried weight. The same stubbornness that had sometimes isolated him could be channeled into persistence that drove institutional change. "There's something I've been considering," Thomas said, stopping along the path. "The Veterans Center asked if I'd be willing to start a support group specifically for disabled vets navigating civilian systems. Banking, healthcare, housing, employment. They think my experience could help others avoid some of the barriers I've faced." Keanu was quiet for a moment. "What do you think?" Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the evening air fill his lungs. "I think maybe that's where I can make the most difference. Not just pushing for policy changes, but helping individuals navigate the world that exists while we work to change it." "That sounds right," Keanu said simply. "Using your map to help others find their way." As they resumed walking, Thomas felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The path ahead was clearer now, illuminated not by sight but by purpose. Years after the incident at First National Bank, Thomas stood at a podium in the city's main plaza, his fingers running over the braille notes prepared for his speech. Behind him, a ribbon waited to be cut, marking the official opening of the city's first accessibility resource center. The crowd that had gathered included veterans, disability advocates, city officials, and hundreds of ordinary citizens who had followed Thomas's journey. "A year ago," Thomas began, his voice carrying across the plaza, "I was just trying to save my home. Today, we're changing how an entire city thinks about accessibility." He paused, feeling the weight of the moment. This center represents more than ramps and braille signage. It represents a fundamental shift in perspective, from treating accessibility as a reluctant legal obligation to recognizing it as a core value of our community. The Accessibility Resource Center stood as the most visible symbol of the changes that had swept through the city. Housed in a renovated historic building, It offered services ranging from legal advocacy to adaptive technology training. One section was dedicated specifically to veterans with disabilities, providing specialized support for those transitioning to civilian life. Thomas served as the director of this veterans program, bringing his unique understanding to those walking a path similar to his own. First National Bank had undergone its own transformation. Following the settlement, they had not only implemented the required changes but had gone further, developing banking tools specifically designed for customers with visual impairments. Their new chief accessibility officer, a woman who had been advocating for disability rights for 20 years, had initiated a complete overhaul of their systems. What had begun as crisis management had evolved into a genuine commitment to inclusive service, with other banks following their lead to remain competitive. The city government had revised building codes, transportation systems, and public services to exceed ADA requirements. Businesses throughout the city displayed new certification stickers indicating their accessibility status, with many proudly advertising their accommodations for various disabilities. The changes weren't perfect, implementation was sometimes slow, and resistance occasionally surfaced, but the momentum continued to build. As Thomas concluded his speech and stepped back from the podium, he felt a familiar presence beside him. Keanu had kept his promise to stay involved, though always in ways that kept the spotlight on the cause rather than himself. He had quietly established a foundation that provided grants for accessibility innovations, with Thomas serving on the board that reviewed applications. "Not bad for a guy who just wanted to make a mortgage payment," Keanu said quietly as they prepared to cut the ribbon. Thomas smiled. "I had some help along the way." After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed to tour the new facility, Thomas and Keanu found a quiet moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them here. "Your foundation just approved funding for 10 new businesses owned by disabled veterans," Thomas said. "One of them is developing navigation technology that might change how blind people move through the world." "That's not my foundation," Keanu corrected. "I provided some initial funding, but it's run by people who understand these challenges firsthand. People like you." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the truth in this. Over the past year, he had transformed from a reluctant symbol into an effective advocate. The skills that had made him an exceptional military leader, strategic thinking, unwavering determination, ability to inspire others, now served him in a different mission. "We're making progress," Thomas said, "but there's still so much to do. For every barrier we remove, we discover 3 more that need addressing." "That's how change works," Keanu replied. "It's never finished. You just keep moving forward, step by step." As they walked through the new center, Thomas reflected on how his life had changed. The mortgage that had nearly cost him his home was now paid several months ahead. His health had stabilized, with better access to medical services and reduced stress contributing to his overall well-being. Shadow still guided him faithfully, now wearing a special harness that identified him as a working dog at the Accessibility Center. But the most profound change wasn't material. It was the shift from isolation to connection, from focusing solely on his own survival to helping create a more navigable world for others. Thomas now had purpose that extended beyond himself, a mission as meaningful as any he'd undertaken in uniform. Later that evening, as Thomas prepared to leave after a long day of celebrations and tours, a young veteran approached him, a woman who had lost her legs in Syria. She thanked him for creating a space where she felt seen and respected rather than pitted or ignored. "You changed this city," she told him simply. Thomas shook his head. "We all did. One person standing up doesn't change much. It's when others join them that the real transformation happens." As he made his way home, guided by Shadow through streets that were incrementally more accessible than they had been a year before, Thomas reflected on how a moment of humiliation had become the catalyst for something powerful and lasting. The path forward wasn't perfectly clear, change never was, but it was a path with purpose, and that made all the difference.